themselves up alive. They're already doing that. So it's like, well, since that's what you want, let me help you. But even with that, and we see this pattern throughout the Old Testament, even though God chastises humans for their disobedience, God always puts a way out, right? Adam and Eve, they rebel, they get thrown away from the garden, but he makes sure they're clothed well, right? And in this case, with he floods the world, but he saves Noah's family, and he puts them in this thing called an ark, which is an Egyptian loanword, teba. Teba is something similar to a shrine, right? It's something that you put sacred items in. So even though God is dealing with the injustice, he still loves humanity enough that he puts humanity in a very special place where you put your most sacred items in. This is what he does with Noah, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But already you see this is vastly different than what we see in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Okay? The role of the flood and Atrahasis, the broad structure of Atrahasis has been identified as parallel to Genesis in that it contains accounts of creation, population growth, and the flood. In Atrahasis, the flood serves as the finale in the God's attempt to deal with the human problem. It is a last resort after several other attempts have been made to solve the problem. So you got these bumbling deities, this pantheon version of the Little Rascals, trying to figure out what we're going to do with these pesky humans. We tried this, it didn't work. We tried that, it didn't work. I get it. How about we just flood the whole thing and let's see if that works? Doesn't sound like very wise, smart deities, right? It sounds like the Keystone Cops in those old silent movies, just bumbling, just trying to figure out what they should do. The role of the flood in Genesis. The flood narrative plays a major role in this sequence as it shows God dealing with the sin of humanity and preserving the blessings promised to them. In this way, we can see that the flood story is about God, not about Noah or even about humanity. It is intended to reveal the character of God, which requires it to take a very different course than the ancient Near Eastern accounts, right? These other gods, they're bumbling, they're upset, they're messy, they're annoyed, right? It's like they're very human in how they move, whereas God is steadfast and his character is just vastly elevated, right? Big difference. So for people to make some kind of, one-to-one correlation just doesn't make sense at all, right? So it is really time, however, to set aside all the discussion about borrowing. First, literary data are insufficient given the current extant text to sustain a case directly from that data. Comparing Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, one could easily see the telltale signs of wholesale borrowing from one literary piece to the next. There are whole lines that are carried over with little alteration. Dependence can be established on purely literary criteria. So they like to say that the Bible copied from these other texts, where when we look at it from the literary data, these other texts are borrowing from one another. They're the ones, if you want to smuggle in a modern concept, plagiarizing, right? Taking whole lines of text. In our modern time, that's copyright infringement, right? That if you copy whole lines of text in your next report for your thesis, you're failing. You're not getting your doctorate. In fact, you're probably getting thrown out of university, right? But this is what these guys are doing. This is far from the case when comparing the biblical account to the Mesopotamian versions. Second, an important distinction must be drawn between borrowing from literature and reacting to literature. If the biblical account is loaded with polemic, it must have a level of awareness of the Mesopotamian traditions. But the intent of the biblical narrator is not simply to offer a recension, or as it more often suggested, to convert the story to a Yahwistic perspective. Polemic is far more aggressive than simple conversion. While conversion may border on plagiarism, polemic is interactive and critical, right? So if we're addressing something that was addressed somewhere else, that doesn't mean that we're borrowing or copying. Like, no, we're making a scathing accusation. But I can't disrespect somebody if I don't know anything about that person, right? Because if I just say this person is dumb, you're going to be like, what person is dumb and what makes them dumb, right? So I got to fill you in. I can give you more content. That dude that lives up the block, Malik and them from Uptown, 125th Street, the one that likes to wear the pink and brown Timbs and the crazy bubble goose. Now you know who I'm talking about. So now when I throw a shot over there, you know who I'm talking about. But you're not gonna be like, oh, you're copying from him. Like, no, I'm telling you who he is, so you know who the shot's being thrown at. I'm not just randomly spraying into the crowd. You know what I mean? It's like I'm going at him. He's the issue, right? And many times in the biblical text, that's exactly what they're doing. They're referencing certain things and certain belief systems and different worldviews so that when they throw a shot, you know exactly who the target is, right? One mark of the coherence of the flood narrative is to be found in literary structure. The tale is cast in the form of an extended paleostrophe. That is a structure that turns back in itself. It's basically like it's kind of like a chiastic structure. It's a poetic form, right? In a paleostrophe, the first item matches the final item. The second item matches the penultimate item, and so on. The second half of the story is thus a mirror image of the first. This kind of literary structure has been discovered in other parts of Genesis 6, but nowhere else is it developed in such a large scale. So when people are saying, well, this flood narrative is copied from these other narratives, when you look at the data, they're borrowing from each other, and the Bible is doing its own thing, describing this same event. And this is one of the devices it uses. This may be partly due to the fact that a flood narrative is peculiarly suited to this literary form. It appears to be a paleostrophe containing 31 items. It begins with and ends with a reference to Noah. Then Noah's sons are named and so on. Particularly striking are the references to days. The periods of time form a symmetrical pattern. The turning point of the narrative is found in verse 1. Well, not verse 1, but it says, God remembered Noah. This is a paleostrophe on a grand scale. So let me show you what they're talking about. So this is the breakdown of the story, right, from Genesis 10, right? So it ends and begins with Noah. And you see how it collapses in itself, right? You see Noah, and then Shem and Japheth, then ark to be built, flood announced, right? But then when you get to the middle of the structure, what it says, God remembers Noah. So it's written specifically for its original audience to understand that at the center of this tale, it's God remembering Noah. Even though God is dealing with the injustice of humanity and can no longer deal with the devaluing of creation coming from his creation, he still remembers Noah. Whereas these other bumbling deities, these puny guys, as Michelle put in the chat, they just like annoyed. I can't stand these humans. They're terrible. Yahweh remembers Noah. What then is the function of the paleostrophe? Firstly, it gives literary expression to the character of the flood event. The rise and fall of the waters is mirrored in the rise and fall of the key words in its description. Secondly, it draws attention to the real turning point in the saga, and God remembered Noah. From that moment, the waters start to decline and the earth to dry out. It was God's intervention that was decisive in saving Noah, and the literary structure highlights this fact. Again, in these other flood narratives, like, what do we do with the human problem? Let's get rid of these guys. Yahweh is like, I remembered Noah, though. And because he remembered Noah, he made sure to bring back creation to its almost Edenic structure, right? The water, recedes, land appears, right? He tells them to be fruitful and multiply. It's the reset button for humanity, as opposed to the final destruction of humanity that these other bumbling, puny gods try to do in their flood narratives. The introductory paragraphs are not incorporated into the main paleostrope, but are linked to it in other ways. The first paragraph tells of God's displeasure at the corruption of the earth. The second tells how Noah was the one exception who found favor in the eyes of the Lord. The first paragraph displays a loose form of panel writing, that is, certain keywords are repeated in a fixed order. And we see that here, right? So we see these various literary structures being implemented in here. You don't see this happening in the other texts. The Epic of Gilgamesh doesn't do any of these things. Okay? And again, we see another mini paleostrope. And then the middle of it is what? Noah was righteous. God remembered Noah. Why? Because Noah was righteous. Noah did the right things in front of God's eyes. And because of that, God remembered Noah. So as wicked as humanity was, God still found a human that was worth saving. And it's kind of interesting that God still finds humans worth saving, doesn't he? As opposed to these other disgruntled, messy, puny gods of the ancient Near East. Right? The center of the pattern this time is Noah was righteous. He was perfect. Once again, a literary form is being used to underline a theological point. Right? When you look at it from the literary structure of the text, the writer is making very poignant statements